This is BBC One. And now Omnibus returns for a new series with a look at the life and comic genius of Tony Hancock, through his work and the people who knew him.
What is the thing that people remember about Tony Hancock? And what? Love is a word. Now, Tommy Trinder, Max Miller, the great stand-up talking comedians, which were huge, big, gigantic stars. You never loved them. You appreciated them. You said, what terrific performers. But with people like Hancock, there was love, great affection.
BBC Television presents Tony Hancock in...
Hancock.
From East Cheam to Earls Court. With writers Alan Simpson and Ray Galton, radio producer Dennis Main Wilson, television producer Duncan Wood, Eric Sykes, Hugh Lloyd.
This lift is not moving until you do get out.
Patricia Hayes.
A couple of dodgy-looking eggs, a fly paper and a mousetrap.
Patrick Cargill.
I'm sorry, but the decision has been taken. We're killing you off on Tuesday night.
It's your pride, that's all. It's been nagging away at you ever since you found out I was an OBE.
OBE?
Yeah, Order of the British Empire.
Bill, you were ordered out of the British Empire.
And Bill Kerr.
I think what I would like to say about Tony is that he was part of us all. He was part of every man that was watching, and every woman. I mean, the human condition. He was the personification of it in comedy. You can get it intellectually, you can find it in great works of art and great writings. But you only had to listen to Tony Hancock for about 5 minutes and you realized he was talking about you.
What a load of old rubbish.
Anthony Aloysius St. John Hancock II. I think it was a character that we created in Tony Hancock's image.
How about replenishing some of these?
May I ask you, first of all, why are you a comic?
Well, I think I always certainly wanted to be from the first time I can remember. And, perhaps looking like this, it was perhaps the only thing I could do. So I turned the sort of deficiencies into a workable thing, if you understand what I mean.
Yes, but let's go a bit deeper than that. Do you think the world is a comic place or is it a tragic place?
Well, I think it consists of the two things. It's both funny and sad, which seem to me to be the two basic ingredients of good comedy.
Basic ingredients. What is being funny? Is it mixing them together? How do you tell
what is funny? Well, I think they
funny?
exist together anyway.
Yes.
By the way we live. When we attempt to be affected or pompous or, how can I say, we are sort of all unsure of ourselves and what we live in. We try to live in a certain way. We are, I suppose, to a certain extent, all affected. And that is both funny and sad, I think.
I first met Tony in 1947 at the Stratton Grand Hotel in Victoria, and there were a lot of young gentlemen named Spike Milligan, Peter Sellers, Alfred Marks, and a rather rotund lad named Mr. Hancock. And he was there, like all of us, looking for work.
BBC had an honours system whereby any returning ex-serviceman could be given an audition even if he was not a professional. So that no returning ex-serviceman could feel that the guys who'd stayed at home had taken advantage of them behind their backs whilst they were fighting for king and country. To this effect, there was a forces club called the Nuffield Centre in the old Gatti's restaurant, where returning ex-servicemen on Tuesday nights and Friday nights could stand up and do their act, just turn up and do it. To a services audience, if you were good, the roof came off. If you were dreadful, they were equivalently horrible. Tony did an act which was the end of a pier show, and he played everybody, the tenor, the young handsome leading man, the corn bearer. He sang the songs, he did the jokes, all terrible as material. He wasn't that brilliant, but there was obviously an enormous talent latent inside him.
I was living in a room in Barons Court and eating a particularly horrible brand of sausage, which at least was filling and sort of kept me going, that sort of thing. But no, there was quite a long time before it really began to take any shape, or that you could say that you were earning a living out of it.
Well, now, when did you earn a living?
I should say from about 1948 onwards.
And how did it start?
At the Windmill, really.
At that time, in the West End, there was Britain's best ever clown, Sid Field.
Don't be foolhardy.
Who was Tony Hancock's idol, I think. In fact, he didn't look unlike Field. Tony modelled himself in part on this great actor, clown, comedian.
What a performance!
And then after the Windmill, then radio came.
Yes.
And you pretty rapidly became a national figure.
No, then again, there were quite long gaps between us. There were a lot of summer seasons and things which were valuable experience to me during this time, and only a few broadcasts.
There was a series which the BBC had started on the Home Service called Happy-Go-Lucky, which starred Derek Roy.
And Tony was the head scoutmaster, and we were all his little Boy Scouts in the troop.
As a thing in show business, never have a show with the word happy in the title. The scripts, frankly, were bad.
We were all fired, and they kept Tony on because they fired the writer also, and they brought in Ray Galton and Alan Simpson.
And they got Tony in one, and he got the hang of their writing in one.
We finished up from writing the whole show, the last 3 or 2 episodes. And
after that, he got in touch with us and asked us if we would write singles for him. You know, in those days, comics used to do a 5-minute spot in
Workers' Playtime.
Workers' Playtime. You know, Variety Ahoy.
Apart from the thrill of writing for him in those days, because he was up and coming, we could see that he was an interesting guy to work. He was also generous as far as we were concerned, because but at that time I think we were earning about £5 a week, and Tony said to us for that 5-minute spot, he said, how much do you charge? We said, well, don't know. He said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you half of my fee, which it was £50, and so he gave us £25, which was enormous amount of money then, and also for what we had been receiving from other nameless comics.
From 8 guineas, I remember, to £25 in one fell swoop. We bought a typewriter on the strength of that, didn't we?
Yeah, we determined to stay in the business after that. Yeah. Having invested in a typewriter, we had to.
The person probably, I think, who did more for Tony in his initial stages was Eric Sykes. Because Tony went into Educating Archie, written by Eric Sykes. And as Galton and Simpson did, Eric latched onto Tony's inner psyche, inner self, inner persona.
Well, it's quite simple, really, because when you talk to Tony anyway, you've got to realize that this man is not a bank manager, and he's not something in the city, he's not a civil servant, and he doesn't sweep the roads. He's obviously a very funny man. He's the old actor-manager, and they're my favourite characters. So here was this actor-manager who looked like an actor-manager when he was young enough to play juvenile leads. So it wasn't difficult for him. You just got him and he did the lines, and that was it. There was a great dignity about Tony.
And it was Eric who gave him what was the first rough, crude Hancock character. It almost gave Tony an attitude to performing. It was still in the early days crude, but it was Eric who invented the tutor. I think that was probably Tony's huge first major step.
Your desk, it's gone.
You see, trigonometry is very difficult, sir.
Andrews, Andrews, where is your desk?
My desk? Oh, my desk. Funny, I had it yesterday.
And if you don't tell me where it is, you'll have had it again today.
We had to get rid of it, sir. It was finished. You see, the inkwells were empty. That's what it was. And
So you think you pulled a swift one, eh? No desk, no lessons.
but you didn't reckon with Dr. Anthony Hancock. And if you sold your desk, you can do your lessons sitting at... Andrews, where's my desk?
Your desk, sir? Aren't you at it?
You're doing your best to get me at it, aren't you?
We sat in my office in Bond Street one night. We suggested that we thought that Hancock was worthy of his own show, Hancock's Half Hour.
The BBC presents Tony Hancock with Moira Lister, Bill Kerr and Sidney James in...
Hancock's Half Hour.
Up until the outbreak of war, middle of the war, we'd had old-fashioned British comedy. It was feed line tag, my wife's a funny woman, hello, hello, I say, etc. Intellectually, it wasn't good. Then the Americans came into the war in 1942, and they were light years ahead of us in radio comedy, and had been since the 1920s. They were doing situation comedy in the mid-1920s, when the BBC was still a company. And they were much more mature and warm, and there's this great Jewish feel as well to American spoken comedy especially. And we'd all heard this throughout the world. You heard the American Forces Network, and we'd got the feel of this as well. So that as the war finished, the Muirs and the Nortons in this world started producing polished comedy like Take It From Here, which was of a very high order, very intelligent, but it was still jokes. They were unreal. It was fantasy, farce, if you will, comfy mum and dad and the children like Life with the Lions, but it was still old-fashioned. Galton and Simpson wanted none of this. They wanted to do a real truth storyline. Looking back, one could have called it Stanislavski method, whatever. We never heard of that because none of us were of the theatre, sadly. But they saw Tony as the true...
Shall I tell you what I thought was the classic? The Sunday Afternoon. And that, of its time, you see, people don't realize that that was a period that we lived through in England when there was no television, there were no distractions as we have now, there were no videos to bung into that little machine. You listened to the radio, or you did what Tony Hancock and all his little cronies did. You sat around twiddling your thumbs on that wet Sunday afternoon, and he was so bored, and also bored the entire nation, but they laughed at him because he was reliving their lives, millions of people's lives. Now, when Tony was going, you didn't ever have to do that and look at him because you knew what he was doing, instinctively. So we all had our eyes on the script, and there's the microphone there, and you knew that Tony was going to do a long pause, and it was hilarious, whatever he was doing, and he wasn't saying anything. And we're talking about sound radio now. When you say there's a pause on sound radio, it's borders on genius to be able to get a laugh on silence.
As the series developed, and we all matured in terms of professionalism and general awareness of life, I think that Alan and Ray, who were younger than us, they began to, not overtly, but in the back of their subconsciouses, was the thought of man's inhumanity to man, as well as just Hancock's ability to perform. And towards the end, it was round about the fourth series, just before I went to television, Tony started to get a bit unhappy and said to me, you know, last week we ended up down the Labour Exchange, the week before we were in the Nick, the week before that, and he said, it's getting a bit, down. He said, I want to be up. Hancock's greatest chef, and Alan and Ray must write me up. He said, I'm being dragged down. Don't want to be dragged down, he said. I want to be pushed up. Because the higher up I am, the harder I got to fall, which comedically is useful, obviously. And he said, if the boys can't do it, I want to get Eric Sykes, he said. He knows how to write me up. which never happened. But the message went to Ellen and Ray, you know, for God's sake, can we not, you know, go down the Labour next week or whatever? And the boys obviously tried. In all, I worked with Tony from 1948 to 1957, when I went to television. And Tony was already there, being obviously produced by Duncan Wood for the successful TV show.
Ronnie Waldman, the then head of BBC Night Entertainment up there, sent for me one morning and said, I've got a job for you. I want you to transfer Hancock's half hour from radio to television. A challenge. I don't think the first shows we ever did were particularly good. They were very verbal, of course, because none of us had learned how to use Hancock as a visual person.
We were basically dialogue writers, so we didn't worry too much about the visual requirements. I mean, a television script of ours is about 7,500 words, and a radio script's about 7,500 words.
In fact, the only person who knew a lot about the visual aspect of things like that was Sid James, who did umpteen films. And Sid used to tell us what take one meant on films and things like that. But then suddenly, two things happened, I think. First of all, one came to realize as a director, and I think the writers came to the same realization, that Tony's strength lay in reaction rather than initiation. And if you could give the plot carrying and the initiation to someone like Sid or to some of the other characters and leave Tony to react, then you were doubling his appeal. The thing that happened quite quickly is that Tony became enamored with the mechanics and with the use of television as a medium. And he started suddenly suggesting various shots to me because he became enamored with the way you could use it. And that meant using his face, which he'd never had to do before. The voice was still the same, but he used to think, if you did things a certain way, I could make this funny without really doing very much.
He was made for a television screen, because when you put a head on a television screen, that's like the Russian dancers on the stage. His face does enough. He wasn't a business comic with his body or do trips or something like that. But his face said everything.
The main difference was that on radio, a situation on radio, you can get more into it, get more characters into it. If we'd have tried to transfer a half-hour radio show to television, it would have probably lasted for about 45 minutes. This is why people often ask, why wasn't Bill Kerr, for instance, in the television show? Why wasn't Hattie Jakes in the television show? Why wasn't Kenneth Williams in the television show? Mainly because of this, because of you do not require as much plot or as many characters in the way we wrote, anyway. Sid and Tony were sufficient for the half-hour format. I used to look forward immensely to having written one that we knew was pretty good. The first read-through, because Hancock had no idea what it was about. Sid had none of them had seen it, except the producer and the girl at the BBC who typed it out. And then we used to get into the place, not unlike this place we're in now, rehearsal room, and they all sit round, have a cup of coffee, and then the scripts would be handed round. It was the first read-through. And Hancock was a fantastic audience with anything that he enjoyed. And if on page one he suddenly thought, this is going to be hysterical, I mean, he could tell what the subject was going to be, and he'd start laughing, because he could visualise what was going to happen. And that was marvellous. And Sid had an infectious laugh as well. And because we used to, sit back there, smiling, enjoying every minute of it, Never once on read-throughs, did we ever have to give him a reading.
Or explain anything.
Or explain any jokes. I mean, he'd pick the script up for the first time, and he'd give a complete, perfect reading of every inflection, was on the nail. The timing was there. It was quite incredible, really. Yeah. I mean, it's very rare that you find this.
It doesn't mean to say he always understood everything. He could give impeccable readings with impeccable timing without knowing what he was saying.
And on the Tuesday, he used to give such a performance. It's something I've never experienced either either before or said, we used to stop rehearsing and applaud him. I mean, in the rehearsal room. Then, of course, by Wednesday, the doubts would come in if he'd remember one scene. By Thursday, it was whether he'd remember any of them.
In a sense, I don't know why, you just felt that the fact that he went along with your performance was a compliment. Because anything he didn't like, he said, I think we'll cut that. I don't think we want that. We won't have any more of that.
Oi! Where's the breakfast, then?
But if you were left in, occasionally you'd get a smile out of him. Tony was never a very, he wasn't nasty at all, but he wasn't particularly friendly to all and sundry. He'd say, morning, morning, hello, hello, like that, you see. He always gave the impression that he was frightfully worried about something. And I don't think anybody ever found out what it was, but he had that worried thing.
It wasn't that he didn't trust people. I think he wanted to do everybody else's job. You know, he wanted to be behind the camera, he wanted to light it, he wanted to know how the sound worked. He wanted to do everything, including make the tea.
I remember he told me, he said, that when I got to know him, he said, you know, it's fascinating to work with real actors. He said, I've been used to working with sort of comics who put on a doctor's white jacket or a postman's cap or something like that, but they're still the comic underneath. He said, working with actors, you are the doctor, you are the postman, you are the lawyer. And he said, I'm able to rebound so much more because I've got real people there.
I always used to say to him, look, you've got to have confidence in me, and luckily we established that in that if you've got something like 250 shots, camera shots that is, in the show, I always used to, my own yardstick was that my margin of error in doing a camera script was 10%. So if I put 250 shots down, 220 of them better be right, and I reserve the right to fool around with the other 30. And the same thing really applied to Tony. I would say to him, I don't think you should concern yourself with, shall we say, the 220 shots out of the 250. What I'm really shooting there is the natural action. What I would like to do now, we always did this on the last day of rehearsal. The other 30 shots, we'll mark a little cross in the script because they come between words. And those are specific reaction shots, which you'll never know I'm taking unless I tell you, because you're not speaking, you're doing anything. So you learn those 30 and leave the other 220 to me, and that's how we worked, and it did seem to get on all right. I thought, I still do, I think, that Tony Hancock's natural timing was the greatest that I've ever worked with or had the pleasure of working with. I mean, I don't think the man could mistime a line if he tried. It was this purely natural thing, and I was going to say the art of it, but it isn't, well, of course, there's a bit of art on top of it, but the natural thing is you could see the man thinking before he said the line. And as a total comprehensive demonstration of how to control the length of a pause before it goes over the edge, and you milk it to everything, or to its full extent before you take that show. Well, I don't know anybody else who could have done it like that. It was a brilliant performance. Brilliant.
People often used to say, when they go on from radio to television, that it didn't look like he sounded. Tony looked, to my mind, looked exactly the way he sounded. He used his face. I remember a sequence once in the reunion party, a perfect example of the use of the face and miming. About a 45-second piece where he's trying to remember somebody's name.
If it wasn't the script, the stage directions about the face were very basic. Simulates sorrow. Nothing much more than that. The rest of it was down to Tony. He used to bring all sorts of changes on it too, yes. He was never instructed about it. I mean, you can't. He used to invent new faces by the week. You couldn't write it down. It was him.
Because the other thing he used to do at the drop of a hat was trying to get in his limited repertoire of impressions. I mean, I think it was Charles Lawton, Robert Newton, George Arliss. I mean, I think as you pointed out, they were old even those days.
But I suppose the mimicry and these, they were desperate, really, because he wasn't a mimic in the terms of, like Peter Sellers or anybody who made a living doing that. So he, it must have been desperation on his part to bring these little things in and save himself from being himself.
It's funny, when you sat with him in a pub, as I did many times, having a drink with him, and if there were a crowd of people there, he never had to be the centre of attraction. He was never the one who always had to be telling the jokes and telling the stories and things. He used to like to sit back and listen to other people telling their anecdotes and enjoying them. And all his time, his eyes would sort of just be wandering round the pub as he was listening to things. And you could see he was observing the various characters in the places. Observing all the time, probably just by observing somebody adding another fraction to this character that he'd created, you know.
I think you're beginning to crack. Have another go.
Yes, I think that's a good idea.
In 12 Angry Men, where he is the foreman of the jury, it wasn't so much in this instance of impersonating known people, it was characteristics of types.
When we came to rehearse it, first of all, and we got at it a bit, of course, being foreman of the jury, he had his big address. He was going to try and sway this jury. This was the Shakespearean actor laddie coming forth. And it suddenly stopped. And we all looked at one another, and he said, you know, I ought to do more there. And I quite agreed. He was just getting into his stride. So we rang up the writers and said, listen, can you write us another minute and a half of this speech, make it a big tour de force for him, which they did brilliantly, incidentally. And he learned that, and he gave it the full McCoy. That was really, this was the actor laddie holding the stage.
Your own comedy character, the one we know in Hancock's Half Hour, swagger, bluster, and then not being very effectual in the end.
Well, I don't think you can sort of really theorise entirely about these things. As I say, this is all sort of part of what you are and part of what everybody else is. It's a comment on yourself and a comment on everybody else, I think.
Well, how much is it a comment on yourself?
Oh, to a great extent, I mean, shall we say the character that, it isn't a character that I play, that I put on and off like a coat. It is greatly a part of me and a part of everybody else that I see.
If Kenneth Graham wanted the prototype of Toad, you have it there. And with everything the Toad had, the bluster, the pomp, the dignity, the frailty, that's on the physical side of him. He looked exactly like Toad. And that was part of his endearing charm, although there were some of the things that he did were diabolical, but you couldn't help liking and loving the man because you were looking at yourself. But the wonderful thing about Tony, that even as a 30-year-old man, he still had a sort of a wisdom about him, a timelessness, and also a frailty, and all the human things that human beings are heir to. As a 30-year-old man, he could have been 60 then.
And to be a great clown, you have got to have vulnerability and indeed humility. And if you ain't got humility as a clown, you ain't gonna be a star. There is no way. Because the audience sense it in their inner selves. And Hancock had all this, to a tragic sense.
What we tried to do with Tony, I think, was avoid pathos, which in itself was pathetic. The man who refuses to be pathetic is a sad character. Faced with all the terrible things that were done to him, he became belligerent. Instead of walking away down the street, like Chaplin used to do. I mean, not knocking Chaplin at all, but there's 40, 50 years difference in the area. But Hancock would never do that. I mean, he hated the idea of being pathetic. He would rather fight back and insist that he preferred being lonely. I mean, after having spent half an hour trying to pull a bird and being turned down, he would then say, well, you're better off on your own anyway. By the time we got onto television in '56, it was as near realism as you can get. The only sort of unreal thing in which never changed really, was that from his personal circumstances used to change from week to week. I mean, even on the telly, one week he was poor, another week he was quite wealthy, one week he was a failed musical comic, next week he was a Shakespearean actor. Nobody cared. We were all in that period of our lives trying to improve ourselves intellectually, trying to reading philosophers, and starting on the self-education bit, as Hancock was. He recognised it was the early 50s, and we were all semi-educated, and at the same time realised that was amusing. We'd taken the mickey out of ourselves, really, all three of us were.
Are you absolutely stuck to this character now? Do you see it modifying and developing at all?
Oh, yes, I think so, definitely. There are certain things I'd like to get away from now, really. They're difficult to talk about and impossible to talk about, really, but gradually you do pull away from... you try and throw away the rubbish. I mean, it accumulates all the time, and you try and throw it away and come down to what is really your own personality. In other words, you spend most of the time discarding, not gathering.
And this is a job that you've not finished doing yet?
Oh, by no means.
Tony felt, and Ray and I agreed at the time, that it was becoming like Laurel and Hardy. It was, the implication being that Tony couldn't work without Sid, and Sid couldn't work without... They're becoming a double act, which, of course, they weren't.
It's difficult to phrase it properly. He didn't say, I don't want Sid anymore. And he didn't really say, I don't need Sid anymore. It could have been anybody. He didn't want to become half of a double act, and that was becoming a thing in his mind that he was, and he was going to get rid of it. And did.
Sid and Bill Kerr and those people in that setup were in actual fact keeping him anchored, so he thought, because it was always going to be go blimey and oh mate and no. And it was all getting that, and he wanted to rise above that. That's why he said Sid James had to go. No feeling of the fact that Sid was, he thought he could do without Sid, or any disrespect to Sid.
And what's more, he at the same time said, I'll get rid of Sid, or whatever phrase you want to use, and I want to get rid of 23 railway cuttings, and I want to get rid of the Black Homburg, and I want to get rid of the Astrakhan collar. And we all had to sit down then, and this was a major rethink. This wasn't just getting rid of Sid, this was he wanted to keep the same character, but it was putting it in totally different settings. It was starting again from scratch.
And we changed from East Cheam to Earls Court. But, really, I mean, essentially the character was the same.
I think that last series was very successful, A, because he had good scripts to work with, but most of all because he had something to prove. You see, he had manoeuvred the writers, and to a certain extent myself, into a position when we went along with him, that we dropped Sid, we had dropped many of the most successful facets of that character, the clothes and everything, and he wanted to prove that he was right, and so he pulled out all the stops in the performance, and it worked.
I think around about 1960, Tony started he started analysing things a bit more. He started taking his art seriously. He would have hitherto been instinctive. He started thinking about.
I think, once you start analysing and thinking, am I doing the right thing? Why am I doing this? The spontaneity goes out of it, and the fun goes out of it. I think, would you say, or would you think that round about that time it was the face-to-face interview with John Freeman?
Oh, yeah.
But that was had a big effect on Hancock, that interview.
Some of the newspaper writers who've tried to puzzle out what makes you tick have said that you're the angst man, the anxiety man. Now, have you any notion of what your anxiety is? Do you, in fact, get a kick out of your anxiety?
How do you think anxiety? Would you explain that a bit more?
Well, something appears to me, even at the end of this conversation, to be eating you. You say that your happiness is just ahead of you still. There's something troubling you about the world. I'd like to know what it is.
I wouldn't expect happiness. I don't think that's possible.
In his personal and private life, I think John Freeman became a sort of the father figure guru to Tony, but not blaming Freeman for Tony's subsequent performances.
You wouldn't then change your way of life at all?
I'd try and improve it, yes.
Well, improve it, but you'd go on in the same way, getting better at what you're doing.
Yes, and if such a time came that I found that I'd come to the end of what I could develop out of my own ability, or limited however it may be, then I wouldn't want to do it anymore.
I think it all sort of ties in. It ties in with this awareness of the fact that he was possibly a good comedian that could possibly be better.
The trouble was afterwards that you could say that was marvellous, and he did start to analyse it in depth as to how it could have been better. I mean, it's an admirable trait, somebody's character, but I wish he could have had a couple of large scotches and said, yes, it went well, didn't it, and leave it at that. Nobody was really in the mood to take it apart. There are some things taking it apart is counterproductive. But he could never stop fiddling with it. He wanted to know how it looked from upstairs and how his performance was, and, you know, taking things apart word by word like that, no. You can never, there's no magic anymore. You're looking at it as though it's a mechanoset and you put it together, and you haven't really. It's a gel that he was in command of.
He had a terrible car accident, you know, at the end of the Bowman, just before we did the blood donor.
He was being driven home, and he was driven into some roadworks at Dulwich, and the car, and he insists, his wife who was driving, went straight down a pit. And he went through the windscreen of the car. It was a Mercedes, a sports Mercedes. He went through the windscreen of it. And luckily he didn't do himself any great injury, had minor concussion. But when I went down to see him the next day, he looked like a panda. He had two of the biggest black eyes I've ever seen in my life. And the thing which was most worrying was this sort of minor concussion. And he couldn't learn. But he didn't want to cancel the show. So it was one of the most difficult jobs that I ever had. We had to take the 40 pages of the script, and we reckoned that we could put 36 of them on idiot cards, putting them alongside the cameras, and I had to reschedule all the camera positions, etc. And just 4 pages of the script, when he was walking around a room, looking, reading, commenting on the posters on the wall. There's no way you can get at an idiot board, a crib card there. And we went ahead and we did the show, and he did it marvellously. It was a great exhibition of technique that he only learnt 4 pages and read the other 36.
I don't know really whether he read off those boards or whether he didn't. My feeling is that he didn't read off them. My feeling is that he actually knew the lines, but he seemed to have lost a little bit of confidence that he knew the lines. And it gave him confidence to know that there was somebody there holding a board with the lines written on them so that he could look at them.
And the fact that he didn't learn 3/4 of that script, went into his little mind and stayed there. He felt, if I can get away with that one, I can get away with anything. And tried to, and in the end, it doesn't matter, in my opinion, how good you are, how technically inclined you are in reading and getting away with it off boards. The performance is never, ever the same. And Tony's performance was never, ever the same.
Tony Hancock, I wonder if you really get very much out of your triumphs. You've got cars that you don't drive. You've got health, which you tell me is a bit ropey because you find you find it so difficult to learn your lines. You've got money that you can't really spend. You worry about your weight.
I spend the money. I do. I enjoy it.
Well, what I want to put to you as a final question is this. You could stop all this tomorrow if you wanted to. You're rich enough to coast along for the rest of your days. Now,
money is of no account in this.
Well, tell me why you go on.
Because,
Tell me why you go on as a last answer.
Because it absolutely fascinates me, because I love it, and because it is my entire life.
And also around this time he decided, he wanted to become an international comedian. He wasn't content with being a parochial English television comedian, which is fine. I mean, very difficult to do in television those days. The way to do that was in the cinema, to become an international star. Hancock had a great sense of history within the business. I mean, he would think in terms of Chaplin, of Lovell, and Hardy, of W.C. Fields, of Tatty. And they'd all done it. They'd all become international. So a man of his art and craft and ambition would want to join them. Quite reasonably.
But this is a man panicking. And he used to panic. Like that his life was slipping away and he wasn't getting there. You know, if he could have made like one good film, then I think he would have been a much more peaceful man.
We stopped writing when our careers went in a different way because of this, indirectly, because of this desire to become international through the films. We had a contract The three of us had a contract to do 3 films for ABP, different subjects, all of which he'd agreed, right, we'll go away and write it. Within a couple of weeks, he'd ring up and say, I've been thinking about it, it's not right, it's not the one, it's not international enough, the Americans won't understand it, this, that and the other. So Tony decided that what he would do is, instead of waiting for us to finish, he would go and he would do a series on ITV, written by other people, and really, that was the last time we ever worked with him. So really, we went around for the last 6 or 7 years. We probably saw him about 3 or 4 times in the last 6 or 7 years of his life.
I'm glad we weren't around, really, at that time.
He eventually, he did away with the BBC, he did away with his authors, did away with his director, all these people who had helped to create him and create this character. And I did at one time, I had a chat to him about this. And he said to me, he said, well, if you got to the top of the ladder, there's nowhere else to go but down. And I remember saying to him, but Tony, surely if you put a plank across to the top of another ladder, you're still there. But he wouldn't have this. He had this terrible fear of going down, of losing the impetus that he'd created. And he thought he could recreate it all if he got rid of all these people.
Ha! Here you are then, young Jim. Ha ha! Mr. Christian. Here, here's a cracker, one for the teenagers. George Arliss. What do you mean, never heard of him?
I don't really think I knew Hancock as a person very well. One of the main reasons being that we spent most of the time working. I think Alan knew him better than I did, but I don't consider I knew Hancock at all beyond a working relationship. The only thing I remember really about it is the Hancock character. And I can't. It's hard to divorce the two. But if I think about, did I know Tony Hancock? No, not really.
But we knew the character, implicitly, because it was us as well.
The great tragedy with Tony, I think, was that while he enjoyed tremendous success as an actor, as a comedian, one never really thought of him, except in isolated moments, as a happy man in himself. And that was the big tragedy. I think he was too mixed up to see clearly where he was going himself.
He made other people shriek, but he himself was rather morose. Always looked at a worry. I could never understand why, because to me, Tony Hancock had everything. He was rather good looking. He was quite attractive. Women were very attracted by him. Very attracted. There were heaps of people who thought he was very, very dishy. He had the world at his feet.
As he became a national star, but star indeed, he began to worry a bit and start to examine himself. I remember he went through a whole thing of reading comparative religions, which is usually the break sign, especially just before you lose your wall completely. It's a man who couldn't find himself, I think.
The thing is, when you get to be as brilliant a man as Hancock was, you don't know what it is that makes you brilliant. It's not like a column of figures that you can add up. You don't know why it is that one person can write and another can't. I mean, it seems simple. You get a pen, you understand English, and we can understand talking, so why can't you write something down? And when you don't know what it is, that's when the worry starts, because you feel it could leave you tomorrow.
With such a great gift, which fills the entire brain and the psyche, there's room for little else. inside you?
I mean, my last meeting with Tony was a sad one. I was on the way to do a show here in town somewhere, and Tony had his coat collar up like this. This is one of the biggest stars in England, and looked as though somebody had put 2 bob in his. Go and buy yourself a coffee, old son. And he said to me, "Come and have a Turkish bath." And I said, "I don't need it." It was summer, and he was like this. It was in German Street, and I said to him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm thinking of going to Australia." He said, "Come and have a Turkish bath with me." I said, "I'm on the way to the theatre, darling. I'll see you. I'll give you a ring." And of course, ships pass in the night, and I never did. But that was my last meeting with Tony.
It was probably the best thing, because he'd really gone over the top, and he was going down for a long time, and that was booze that was killing him. Out of frustration, he was drinking more and more and more, and the more he drank, and the less his talent. There wasn't a shadow of the old Hancock. So probably, it's just a terrible way it happened in a lonely hotel bedroom, the other side of the world.
I think Tony must have been a very funny, if sad, little boy, I have a feeling, because there was a great sadness with everything that he did, making people laugh. But that is the classic story of Grock, isn't it? Going to see a psychiatrist or a doctor in France in the old days and saying, "I am very unhappy, can you give me some pills?" And the doctor said, "My friend, go and see Grock, he'll make you laugh." He said, "I am Grock." I think that's... As a matter of fact, Tony told me that story.
Some of those memorable Hancock programs we've seen clips from tonight, such as The Blood Donor, The Radio Ham and The Bowmans, are now available on BBC Videos, together with that episode which involved Hancock in the lift, and to be released later next month, The Bed Sitter and The Poison Pen Letters. Also BBC records and cassettes capturing the unique and timeless humour of Tony Hancock are available as well. Well, next week's Omnibus looks at the painter Malcolm Morley, who became the first winner of the Tate Gallery's prestigious new award, the Turner Prize, and filmed